"You'll eat after everyone else," Rebecca said without looking up from the platter in her hands, her tone so casual that for half a second no one at the table seemed to understand what she had just said. Margaret Whitmore stood frozen beside the dining room sideboard, the silver serving spoon still in her hand, steam rising from the green bean casserole she had spent an hour preparing in Rebecca's kitchen. The room went quiet in that terrible, unnatural way family rooms do when everyone hears something cruel but no one wants to be the first to react. Candlelight flickered against the polished oak table. Crystal glasses gleamed beneath the chandelier. The scent of roasted turkey, buttered rolls, and cinnamon sweet potatoes filled the air. It should have felt warm. It should have felt like Thanksgiving. Instead, Margaret felt as if every pair of eyes in the room had turned her into a stranger. She blinked slowly, certain she must have misheard. "I'm sorry," she asked, her voice calm despite the sudden pounding in her chest. Rebecca finally looked at her then, her smile polished and thin, the kind of smile women wore when they wanted to appear gracious while twisting the knife. "There aren't enough seats at the main table, Mom," she said sweetly. "We thought it would make more sense if you helped finish serving first. You can eat once everyone else is settled." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Rebecca's husband, Daniel, stared hard into his wineglass. Her teenage sons suddenly found their mashed potatoes fascinating. No one said a word. Margaret's eyes drifted to the dining table she had helped set that afternoon, to the 10 carefully arranged place settings with gold-edged china and folded linen napkins. She counted them once. Then again. 10 seats. 10 guests. Everyone had a place card. Everyone except her. The realization hit with the slow, sickening force of ice water sliding down her spine. This had not been an oversight. It had been planned. She had been invited to cook, to carry dishes, to help host a holiday in her daughter's home. And somewhere along the way, Rebecca had decided her mother no longer deserved a seat at the table. Margaret set the casserole down carefully on the sideboard. Her hands were steady. That surprised even her. "Of course," she said softly. Rebecca gave a satisfied nod and turned back to the table. "Thank you, Mom. You're always so helpful." Helpful. Margaret swallowed against the bitterness rising in her throat. 22 years ago, she had worked double shifts at St. Anne's Medical Center so Rebecca could attend ballet lessons in private school. 15 years ago, she had emptied half her retirement fund to help Rebecca and Daniel make the down payment on this very house. Last spring, when Rebecca needed emergency childcare for 3 months while her nanny recovered from surgery, Margaret had driven 40 minutes each way every weekday without complaint. Helpful. The word echoed in her head as she stepped back toward the kitchen, the laughter at the dining table slowly resuming behind her like nothing had happened. Like she had not just been dismissed from her own family's celebration like hired staff. She stood alone at the kitchen counter staring at the untouched pie she had baked from scratch that morning. Her reflection faint in the darkened window above the sink. From the dining room came bursts of conversation, forks clinking against china, Rebecca's bright voice floating above the others as if she had done nothing unusual at all. Margaret pressed her fingertips lightly against the marble countertop and breathed through the ache building in her chest. Humiliation had a strange taste, she thought. Metallic, cold, familiar in ways she had never allowed herself to examine before. Because standing there in the silence of her daughter's kitchen, listening to her family eat without her, Margaret realized with sudden devastating clarity that this was not the first time Rebecca had made her feel small. It was only the first time she had done it where everyone could see. And as Margaret lifted her chin and stared at her reflection in the glass, something inside her, something patient and forgiving and endlessly accommodating, finally went still. Rebecca thought she had taught her mother where her place was. She had no idea what she had just set into motion. Margaret waited until the laughter in the dining room swelled loud enough to drown out the sound of the faucet before she turned on the water and began washing dishes no one had asked her to wash. Her hands moved automatically, rinsing gravy from serving spoons and stacking used mixing bowls while the warmth of the water stung her skin. She could hear Rebecca hosting from the next room in that bright, polished voice she reserved for guests, laughing too hard at small jokes, accepting compliments on dishes Margaret herself had prepared before sunrise. "Everything is wonderful, Rebecca," someone said. "You outdid yourself this year." Rebecca laughed lightly. "Thank you. It was a lot of work. But you know me. I always make the holidays happen." Margaret stood motionless for a moment, her hand wrapped around a wet plate. Then she resumed scrubbing. By the time the family drifted into the living room with coffee and pie, Margaret had still not been called to the table. No one came to check on her. No one asked whether she had eaten. The realization settled deeper than the humiliation itself. It was not merely Rebecca's cruelty that cut her. It was the ease with which everyone else accepted it. After nearly 40 minutes, Margaret finally stepped into the now half-empty dining room. Cold scraps remained on serving platters. A torn dinner roll sat abandoned beside a used napkin. Someone had left a smear of cranberry sauce across the tablecloth she had ironed herself the night before. She stood there for a long moment staring at the wreckage of the meal she had cooked but never shared, then quietly made herself a plate from what little remained. The turkey had gone dry. The potatoes were lukewarm. The gravy had formed a skin. She sat alone at the breakfast nook in the corner of the kitchen and ate in silence while laughter spilled from the living room like music from a party she had not been invited to. As she pushed the final bite of cold stuffing around her plate, memory after memory began surfacing with brutal clarity, each one sharp now in a way it had never been before. The birthday dinner 2 years ago when Rebecca had forgotten to save her a seat at the restaurant and laughed, saying, "Oh, I assumed you would not stay long anyway." The Christmas morning when Rebecca had handed everyone matching monogrammed robes except Margaret, then claimed the order had arrived wrong. The school recital where Rebecca had accidentally given Margaret the wrong start time, forcing her to miss her grandson's solo while the rest of the family sat front row. At the time, Margaret had explained each incident away. Rebecca was stressed. Rebecca was distracted. Rebecca did not mean it like that. But sitting alone in that kitchen, chewing food that tasted like ash, Margaret finally saw the pattern for what it was. None of it had been accidental. Rebecca had not suddenly begun disrespecting her mother. She had simply grown comfortable enough to stop disguising it. Later, when coats were gathered and guests began saying their goodbyes, Margaret rose quietly to retrieve hers from the front hall closet. Rebecca noticed her near the door and approached with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Leaving already?" she asked, as if Margaret had merely stopped by for coffee instead of spending 10 hours helping prepare the holiday. Margaret buttoned her coat slowly. "It is getting late." Rebecca tilted her head. "Thank you again for helping today. I do not know what I would do without you." Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment. Rebecca's face was beautiful in the way polished things often were, flawless and cold and impossible to hold on to. Then Margaret smiled. "Small and unreadable. That may be something you should start figuring out," she said. Rebecca's smile faltered, only for a second, but Margaret saw it. She turned and walked into the cold November night without another word. The wind cut sharp across the driveway as she made her way to her car, dead leaves skittering over the pavement around her heels. She sat behind the wheel for several moments before starting the engine, her hands resting lightly on the leather. Then, in the darkness of the quiet suburban street, Margaret Whitmore made a decision she should have made years ago. If Rebecca wanted to teach her mother that respect had to be earned, then Margaret would teach her daughter what it cost to lose it. The following Monday morning, Margaret sat in the quiet office of her attorney, Richard Holloway, with her gloves folded neatly in her lap and a leather folder resting on the polished mahogany desk between them. Richard had handled her affairs for more than 20 years, first with her late husband and then with her after his passing, and in all that time he had never once seen her look the way she did now. Not angry, not tearful, simply resolved. Tell me exactly what you would like changed, he said gently. Margaret drew in a slow breath. Everything that involves Rebecca. Richard removed his glasses. That is a significant decision. It is a long overdue one, Margaret replied. Her voice remained even, but something in it had hardened. She outlined every contribution she had made to her daughter over the years, the college tuition she had covered when scholarships fell short, the down payment she had gifted for Rebecca's first house, the monthly checks she still quietly deposited into an education fund for her grandsons, the vacation condo Rebecca assumed would one day become hers. Richard listened without interruption, his expression growing more sober with each revelation. I was under the impression your daughter was your sole beneficiary, he said carefully. She was, Margaret answered, when I believed she loved me more than what I could provide. Richard nodded once. And now? Margaret looked out the window at the bare trees swaying beyond the glass. Now I understand the difference between being loved and being used. For the next hour, they rewrote everything. Rebecca would no longer inherit the lake cottage in Vermont that had been in Margaret's family for 3 generations. The education trust Margaret had established for the boys would be transferred into an account only accessible directly to them at age 25, beyond Rebecca's reach. The charitable foundation Margaret and her husband had once discussed supporting would receive the bulk of her estate. Rebecca would receive a token sum of $1. Enough to make her exclusion deliberate and legally unmistakable. Richard reviewed the documents carefully. Once this is signed, it will be difficult to contest. Margaret took the pen and signed without hesitation. As the ink dried, she felt no triumph, only clarity. On the drive home, her phone rang through the car speakers. Rebecca. Margaret let it ring twice before answering. Hello. Dear. Rebecca's voice came bright and sugary, so dramatically warm that Margaret almost laughed. Mom, I just wanted to check in. You seemed a little off when you left yesterday. Margaret kept her eyes on the road. Did I? Well, yes. I hope you were not upset. Thanksgiving was hectic. And if there was some misunderstanding about seating, there was no misunderstanding, Margaret said quietly. Silence met her words. Then Rebecca gave a brittle laugh. You are being dramatic. It was one dinner. Margaret's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Yes, she said. That is exactly what it was. Rebecca hesitated, sensing something beneath the calm tone she could not quite read. Well, I just do not want you making a big deal out of nothing. The boys adore having you around, and we still need your help next weekend for Carter's soccer tournament. Daniel has a work retreat and I promised the team I would organize snacks. There it was. Not apology. Not remorse. Just another request. Another assumption that Margaret would continue showing up whenever summoned, grateful for scraps of inclusion. She smiled to herself as she turned into her driveway. I am afraid I will not be available. Rebecca sounded startled. What do you mean unavailable? I have decided to be less helpful. The line went silent again. Margaret parked the car and shut off the engine. You will have to make other arrangements, she said. Then, before Rebecca could respond, she ended the call. She sat in the stillness of the car for a moment, the late afternoon sunlight stretching gold across her windshield. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel lonely, felt like peace. Inside the house, her phone buzzed 3 more times with texts from Rebecca, each one sharper than the last. But Margaret placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter and poured herself a cup of tea. Let her daughter wonder, she thought. Let her daughter worry. For the first time in Rebecca's life, the woman she had always counted on was no longer standing where she expected her to be. Rebecca lasted 4 days before showing up at Margaret's front door unannounced. Margaret saw her daughter's white SUV pull into the driveway just after noon on Friday and took her time opening the door, finishing her tea before crossing the foyer. Rebecca stood on the porch in designer sunglasses and an expensive camel coat. Her smile strained so tightly it looked painful. "You have been ignoring my calls," she said by way of greeting. Margaret leaned lightly against the door frame. "I have been enjoying the quiet." Rebecca laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Very funny. Can I come in?" Margaret stepped aside. Rebecca swept into the house with the air of someone entering property she already considered partially hers. Her eyes moved instinctively over the grand staircase, the crown molding, the antique grandfather clock in the entryway, the details of a home she had admired less for its beauty than for what it represented. Margaret noticed that now. She noticed everything now. Rebecca followed her into the sitting room and remained standing. "What exactly is going on with you?" she demanded. "The boys were disappointed you canceled on Saturday. Carter kept asking where Grandma was." Margaret lowered herself into her armchair with composed precision. "Then perhaps his mother should have explained that Grandma has a life of her own." Rebecca blinked. "Since when?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. The room went still. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "That is an interesting question." Rebecca exhaled sharply and dropped onto the sofa opposite her. "Okay. Clearly you are still upset about Thanksgiving. Mother, for heaven's sake. You are acting like I banished you to the garage. It was one holiday dinner. You are being overly sensitive." Margaret studied her daughter's face. The familiar features she had kissed as a baby, soothed through nightmares, cheered from bleachers and auditoriums in graduation stages. How strange, she thought, that someone could wear the face of the child you loved and still become a stranger. "Do you truly not understand what you did?" Margaret asked. Rebecca crossed her arms. "I asked you to be flexible during a busy dinner." Margaret gave a faint smile, the kind people used when they had finally stopped expecting honesty. "No. Rebecca, you humiliated me in front of my own family because you believed I would tolerate it." Rebecca's expression hardened. "Do not be dramatic. You always do this. Every time something does not go exactly your way, you act wounded until everyone bends over backward reassuring you." Margaret stared at her in silence, and Rebecca, perhaps mistaking that silence for weakness, pressed on. "Honestly, Mother, you should be grateful we include you as much as we do. Most women your age would be thrilled to spend so much time with their grandchildren. Half the time it feels like you forget your role here." Margaret's voice remained perfectly level. "And what role is that?" Rebecca gave a short, impatient laugh. "Support. Help. Family. You know, the things mothers are supposed to do." There it was. Not affection. Obligation. Rebecca did not see her mother as family. She saw her as infrastructure. A permanent fixture. A useful thing that cooked meals, wrote checks, watched children, and remained available without requiring dignity in return. Margaret rose slowly from her chair. "I spent most of my life making excuses for you," she said. "I told myself you were stressed, busy, overwhelmed, misunderstood. But the truth is much simpler than that. I raised a daughter who mistakes kindness for weakness." Rebecca stood abruptly. "That is ridiculous." "Is it?" Margaret asked. "Tell me, Rebecca, if I had no money, no house, no free time, no help to offer you at all, how often would you call?" Rebecca's face changed, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for Margaret to see the answer before a word was spoken. "That is what I thought," Margaret said softly. Rebecca's voice sharpened. "So what is this? Some punishment? You are going to sulk and withhold help because your feelings got hurt?" Margaret walked to the doorway and opened it. The gesture was elegant. Final. No, Rebecca, she said. I am simply correcting a misunderstanding. You believed I would always accept less than I deserve. I will not. Rebecca stared at her, color rising in her cheeks. You are making a mistake. Margaret's smile was calm enough to unsettle her. No, dear. You already made it for both of us. And as Rebecca stormed past her into the cold afternoon, Margaret stood in the doorway and watched her daughter leave with the quiet certainty of a woman who had finally stopped mistaking blood for loyalty. The silence between mother and daughter stretched for nearly 2 weeks, and Margaret found that peace settled over her house like fresh snow. No frantic requests for school pickups. No last-minute demands to babysit. No texts disguised as affection but ending in favors. For the first time in years, her days belonged entirely to her. She attended her book club without interruption, took long morning walks through the neighborhood with a cup of coffee in hand, and lingered over dinner she prepared only for herself, discovering that solitude was far less painful than disrespect. Then, on the second Tuesday of December, the phone rang just after 8 in the evening. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and saw Daniel's name. Her son-in-law had never called her directly in all 12 years of marriage, unless Rebecca specifically instructed him to. She answered with quiet curiosity. Daniel. His voice came low and uncertain. Margaret. I hope this is not a bad time. She sat straighter in her chair. What is it? He hesitated long enough that she knew whatever came next would matter. I thought you should know Rebecca has been telling people you are becoming forgetful. She has been saying you are emotionally unstable since Thanksgiving. Margaret's expression did not change, but her grip tightened on the phone. Go on. Daniel exhaled. She met with a family friend who handles elder care planning. She asked what steps would be involved if an aging parent could no longer manage their finances independently. The room seemed to grow very still. Margaret's voice remained calm. Did she say why? Another pause. She said she is worried about your judgment lately. She said you have become irrational, isolated, difficult. She mentioned your house several times. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The motive beneath the disrespect. Not merely entitlement. Strategy. Rebecca had not humiliated her because she no longer valued her mother. She had humiliated her because she believed the woman in front of her was nearing the stage of life where dignity could be stripped away and called concern. Why are you telling me this? Margaret asked quietly. Daniel's answer came softer than she expected. Because I am ashamed I did not speak up sooner. Margaret said nothing. He continued. I have watched her treat you badly for years and convinced myself it was not my place. But this is different. She thinks if enough people believe you are slipping, she can pressure you into giving her some kind of financial control. She said it would make things easier for everyone. Margaret stared into the darkness beyond her window, where snow had begun drifting softly beneath the porch light. Thank you for telling me. Daniel's voice dropped lower. Be careful. Margaret. She is serious. When the call ended, Margaret sat motionless for several minutes, the phone still resting in her hand. Then she rose, walked to the small study at the back of the house, and opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside was the leather estate binder Richard had prepared the previous week. She set it on the desk and slowly ran her hand over the cover. So that was Rebecca's plan. If guilt no longer worked, she would use reputation. If shame no longer controlled her mother, she would portray her as incompetent. Margaret almost admired the calculation of it. Almost. The next morning, she called Richard again and scheduled another meeting. This time she requested additional protections. Medical directives naming an independent fiduciary, not family. Legal letters documenting her mental competency. Instructions requiring psychological evaluation before any claim of incapacity could be entertained. She built walls Rebecca would never see coming. Then she did something else. Something smaller, but no less deliberate. She canceled the credit card she had quietly kept Rebecca on for emergencies. She stopped the monthly deposits into the boys' activity fund and rerouted them directly into the protected trust accounts. She withdrew her annual contribution to Rebecca's holiday hosting budget. By Friday afternoon, her phone lit up with furious messages. Did you remove me from the card? The soccer account says payment failed. The caterer says the Christmas deposit bounced. Margaret read each text without replying. Then, alas, one final message appeared. Mother, what exactly are you doing? Margaret set the phone down beside her untouched tea and smiled faintly into the winter quiet. For the first time in her daughter's life, consequences had arrived before excuses could. Rebecca arrived at Margaret's house 3 days before Christmas in a state of barely controlled fury, her expensive heels striking the front walkway with the sharp rhythm of someone who still believed anger was power. Margaret had just finished arranging white roses in the foyer when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find her daughter standing rigid beneath the porch light, cheeks flushed from the cold and from rage. You canceled my card. Rebecca snapped before Margaret could speak. You stopped the boys' accounts. The holiday caterer called me in front of guests because her payment failed. Margaret stepped aside calmly. Then I suggest you come inside if you intend to discuss finances. Shouting on my porch is tacky. Rebecca swept past her without waiting. She marched into the sitting room and spun around. What kind of cruel game is this? Margaret remained standing, composed as ever. No game. I am simply reallocating my resources. Rebecca stared at her in disbelief. Those funds were for family. Margaret tilted her head slightly. No, Rebecca. Those funds were from family. The distinction hit harder than if she had shouted. Rebecca's face tightened. You cannot just cut us off because of one disagreement. Margaret's smile was small and almost pitying. One disagreement does not build a decade of resentment. Rebecca took a sharp step forward. You are punishing your grandsons to get back at me. No, Margaret said. I am protecting my grandsons from learning that love means allowing yourself to be used. Rebecca laughed bitterly. Used? Are you serious? After everything I have done to include you in our lives? Margaret almost marveled at the audacity. Include me? She repeated softly. You invited me into your home to cook meals I did not eat, watch children you weaponize for guilt, and provide support you now mistake for entitlement. Rebecca's voice rose. You are unbelievable. You think writing checks makes you some kind of martyr? Mothers help their daughters. That is what family does. Margaret met her gaze without blinking. Family also honors the people who help them. Rebecca's expression changed then, shifting from outrage to calculation. Her tone softened instantly, becoming honeyed, almost tearful. Mom. Please. We have all been stressed lately. The boys miss you. I miss you. Let us not let pride ruin this family. Margaret watched the performance unfold with the detached calm of someone seeing a familiar play for the final time. If you missed me, she said quietly, you would have treated me with kindness before your funding disappeared. Rebecca's mask slipped. Her face hardened with sudden, naked contempt. Fine. She hissed. You want honesty? Here it is. You have always been too sensitive, too dramatic, too convinced the world should revolve around you because you are old and lonely. We tolerated your moods because it was easier than dealing with them. But if you think withholding money makes you important, you are pathetic. The room fell silent. Margaret did not flinch, did not gasp, did not cry. She simply looked at her daughter with the calm clarity of a woman hearing the truth spoken plainly at last. Thank you, she said. Rebecca frowned. For what? Margaret's voice was soft enough to force Rebecca to lean in. for finally saying it without pretending otherwise. Rebecca's confidence faltered. What is that supposed to mean? Margaret walked to the antique desk in the corner of the room and opened its top drawer. From inside, she withdrew a cream envelope sealed with a gold crest. She turned and held it out. Rebecca stared at it suspiciously. What is this? Margaret's smile was elegant and cold. A copy of the changes made to my estate planning. Rebecca snatched the envelope and tore it open. Her eyes scanned the first page. Then the second. Her face drained of color so quickly it was almost theatrical. What is this? She whispered. Exactly what it appears to be. Margaret said. You asked what I was doing. Rebecca, I am ensuring my life's work goes to people and causes that value it. Rebecca looked up, trembling now with something beyond anger. Panic. You cannot do this. Margaret folded her hands in front of her. I already did. Rebecca stared at her mother as though seeing her for the first time, and in many ways she was. Because the woman standing before her was no longer the one who begged for scraps of respect in exchange for unconditional giving. That woman was gone. And Rebecca, for the first time in her life, understood she had pushed too far. Rebecca stood frozen in the center of the sitting room, clutching the papers with trembling hands as though the words might rearrange themselves if she stared hard enough. This is insane, she whispered. You rewrote everything over a dinner argument? Margaret's expression remained calm. No, Rebecca. I rewrote everything after finally accepting who you are. Rebecca let out a bitter laugh, but panic sharpened every edge of it. You are serious? You are actually willing to destroy your relationship with your own daughter over hurt feelings? Margaret folded her arms lightly. You destroyed this relationship long before I changed paperwork. I merely stopped pretending otherwise. Rebecca's eyes flashed. This is elder abuse in reverse. Do you understand that? Manipulating your family with money? Threatening your own daughter? Margaret almost smiled. Interesting choice of words from someone exploring how to claim her mother is mentally incompetent. The color vanished from Rebecca's face. For a moment, real fear broke through her fury. Who told you that? Margaret's gaze remained steady. Does it matter? Rebecca swallowed hard, then tried one final pivot. Tears welled instantly in her eyes, sudden and theatrical. Mom, please. I was frustrated. I said things I did not mean. We all say things in anger. But this is cruel. The boys are your family. You would punish them because of me? Margaret's voice softened, though not with sympathy. No. I protected them from your access. They will receive what I choose for them directly, when they are old enough to understand the difference between love and leverage. Rebecca's tears vanished as quickly as they had appeared. You sanctimonious old woman. She spat. You think you are teaching me some lesson? Fine. Keep your money. Keep your precious estate. See how often anyone visits you when you have nothing left to offer but lectures. The room fell silent after the words landed. Even Rebecca seemed startled she had said them aloud. Margaret did not react immediately. She simply looked at her daughter with a quiet sadness deeper than anger. Then she nodded once, almost to herself. Thank you, she said. Rebecca blinked. What now? Margaret's voice was gentle, almost tired. I spent years wondering whether perhaps I had failed you somehow, whether I had been too strict, too indulgent, too absent, too forgiving. Mothers do that. You know, we search ourselves for the source of every flaw in our children. But hearing you now. She paused and drew a slow breath. I understand at last that some people simply choose who they become. Rebecca's jaw clenched. Do not talk down to me. Margaret stepped toward the front door and opened it. Snow flurries drifted through the gray afternoon air beyond the threshold. Leave my home. Rebecca. Her daughter stared at her in disbelief. You cannot be serious. Entirely. Rebecca's voice rose, brittle with humiliation. You are throwing me out? Me? Margaret's face remained unreadable. Yes. Before I decide that $1 was still too generous. Rebecca stood motionless for half a heartbeat, then stormed toward the door, shoving past her mother hard enough to brush her shoulder. She stopped at the threshold and turned. Breathing fast. You will regret this, she hissed. Margaret met her gaze without blinking. No, she said softly. That is your burden now. The door closed between them with a quiet final click. Margaret remained still in the foyer long after the sound of Rebecca's car disappeared down the street. She expected grief, perhaps even guilt. Instead, what she felt was relief so profound it nearly made her dizzy. She walked back into the sitting room, gathered the estate papers Rebecca had dropped in her panic, and returned them to the desk drawer. Then she crossed to the window and watched the snow fall over the darkening lawn, peaceful and silent and untouched. Her phone began buzzing almost immediately. Rebecca, then Daniel, then unknown relatives Rebecca had undoubtedly called first, spinning some version of the story where she was the victim of an irrational old woman's cruelty. Margaret muted the phone and set it aside. Let them call. Let them speculate. Let them hear whatever lies Rebecca needed to tell herself. Truth had a way of surviving without explanation. And somewhere deep beneath the quiet ache that always came when a mother finally stopped protecting the child who hurt her, Margaret felt something stronger rising to take its place. Freedom. The smear campaign began the week after Christmas. Margaret learned of it the way women her age often learn it: uncomfortable truths, through polite voices carrying awkward concern. A neighbor from church called to ask if everything was all right because Rebecca had mentioned Margaret was having a difficult time emotionally. An old family friend stopped her after Sunday service and gently suggested that grief sometimes surfaced later in life in strange ways, then patted her hand with the careful pity reserved for people believed to be unraveling. Margaret listened to each conversation with serene composure, thanked them for their concern, and said very little. By New Year's Day, she understood the full scope of Rebecca's strategy. If she could not regain control through guilt, she would undermine her mother socially. She would paint Margaret as unstable, bitter, and increasingly irrational until every boundary Margaret set looked like proof of decline instead of self-respect. It was clever, cruel, and exactly what Margaret should have expected. So when her sister Evelyn called to invite her to the annual Whitmore family New Year's dinner, Margaret accepted immediately. Rebecca will be there, Evelyn warned carefully. I know, Margaret replied. That is why I am coming. The Whitmore gathering had always been a polished affair. Crystal stemware, silver serving dishes, old money and older grudges tucked beneath tasteful conversation. Margaret arrived in a navy silk dress with pearl earrings and her silver hair pinned neatly at her neck, looking every bit the composed widow people had known for decades. Conversations softened as she entered. She noticed the glances, the curiosity, the subtle way heads turned toward Rebecca at the far end of the room. Rebecca herself looked momentarily stunned, as if she had not expected her mother to appear at all. Then came the practiced smile. Mom, she said brightly, crossing the room with exaggerated warmth. I am so glad you made it. Everyone has been worried about you. There it was, the opening move. Margaret smiled back with equal grace. How thoughtful. Dinner began with all the usual rituals of wealth and civility. Champagne poured, blessings offered, compliments exchanged over roast beef and rosemary potatoes. But beneath the surface, the tension sat thick as smoke. Margaret waited patiently. She did not have to create a scene. Rebecca would do that herself. It happened during dessert. Cousin Laura asked lightly whether Margaret had plans to travel in the spring, and before Margaret could answer, Rebecca gave a sad little sigh. We are not sure traveling is wise for her right now, she said. She has been struggling lately. Memory issues. Mood swings. We are trying to take things one day at a time. Forks paused midair. The room went still. Margaret set down her coffee cup with delicate precision. Then she turned toward her daughter and smiled the way one might smile before closing a trap. That is fascinating, Rebecca. she said softly, because according to the independent competency evaluations, legal certifications, and physician reports I completed last month, my memory and judgment are excellent. The color drained from Rebecca's face. Margaret reached calmly into her handbag and withdrew a sealed folder, placing it on the table with quiet finality. I anticipated you might continue spreading such concerns, she said. So I came prepared. No one moved. No one breathed. Margaret's voice remained gentle enough to make every word hit harder. What I did not anticipate was that you would be reckless enough to repeat lies in front of witnesses. Rebecca stared at the folder as if it might explode. Mom, I was only worried. No, Margaret said, cutting her off with a calm so absolute it silenced the room. You were preparing a narrative, one in which I seemed unstable enough to control, one in which your greed looked like concern. A shocked murmur rippled through the table. Daniel lowered his gaze into his plate. Evelyn looked as though she might faint. Rebecca's face burned crimson. That is not true. Margaret held her daughter's gaze. Then explain why you consulted elder care advisors about gaining financial authority over me before ever speaking to my physician. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it. Nothing came out. The silence that followed was devastating. It was the kind of silence that stripped illusion from a room, the kind no lie survived. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, every movement elegant and unhurried. She looked around the table at the faces staring back in stunned realization. Then she turned to Rebecca one final time. You spent years treating me as though I should wait for whatever scraps of dignity you chose to offer, she said quietly. Now you may spend the rest of your life explaining why you lost everything over your inability to show basic respect. And with that, Margaret picked up her coat, left the untouched dessert on the table, and walked out while behind her the family sat in the ruins of Rebecca's carefully crafted image. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca's world began unraveling in ways Margaret never had to orchestrate herself. The family had witnessed enough that night to understand exactly what had happened, and once doubt entered people's minds, Rebecca's carefully polished image cracked faster than she could repair it. Calls stopped being returned as quickly. Invitations grew fewer. Relatives who had once laughed at her stories now listened with guarded expressions whenever she spoke. Even Daniel changed. Margaret heard through Evelyn that he had moved into the guest room after discovering just how long Rebecca had been planning to secure control over her mother's finances. Apparently, there were arguments late into the night, sharp enough for the boys to hear through closed doors. By February, rumors spread quietly through their social circle that the marriage was in trouble. Margaret did not celebrate any of it. She simply watched from a distance with the detached calm of someone who had finally learned that consequences did not require revenge when truth was allowed to stand on its own. Rebecca tried calling several times after New Year's. First, the messages were furious, then pleading, then carefully rewritten to sound reasonable. As if enough editing could erase the contempt behind them, Margaret listened to none of them. She archived every voicemail unread. Then, one bright morning in early March, her doorbell rang unexpectedly. Margaret opened the door to find her older grandson, Carter, standing alone on the porch with his backpack hanging from one shoulder and uncertainty written across his young face. "Dad brought me," he said quietly. "He is waiting in the car." Margaret looked past him and saw Daniel parked at the curb, offering her a solemn nod through the windshield. She stepped aside immediately. "Come in, sweetheart." Carter entered slowly, clutching the strap of his backpack. He had grown taller recently, Margaret noticed. His voice had deepened just enough to remind her that children changed even while adults were distracted by their own battles. They sat together in the kitchen over cocoa, and after several minutes of nervous stirring, Carter finally looked up. "Mom said you hate us now." Margaret's heart clenched, but her voice remained gentle. "No, darling, I could never hate you." He frowned. "Then why do you not come over anymore?" Margaret chose her words carefully. because children remembered the way truth was delivered to them. Sometimes people love each other and still need distance when they are not being treated kindly. Carter stared into his mug. Mom says families should forgive each other no matter what. Margaret gave a faint, sad smile. Families should love each other enough not to use forgiveness as permission to keep hurting people. He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that in the serious way children sometimes did when they sensed they were being told something important. Then he nodded slowly. Dad says you were right to stand up for yourself. Margaret looked toward the window, where Daniel remained respectfully in the car, and felt a small flicker of gratitude. Your father is a wise man. Carter reached across the table and took her hand. I missed you. This time, Margaret's composure nearly broke. She squeezed his hand gently. I missed you too. From then on, Daniel brought the boys to visit regularly on his custody weekends after he and Rebecca quietly separated that spring. The house filled again with laughter, card games, baking flour on countertops, and the kind of love that asked for nothing but presents. Rebecca, meanwhile, remained absent. Pride kept her away longer than anger ever could. Margaret heard she still told people her mother had manipulated the family against her. But fewer believed it now. Time had a way of exposing patterns. And one Sunday afternoon, months later, as Margaret sat on her back porch watching her grandsons chase fireflies across the yard while the summer sun dipped gold behind the trees, she understood something with perfect clarity. The deepest victory was never taking revenge. It was refusing to remain where you were not valued. She had once stood in a dining room and been told to wait until everyone else had eaten, as if dignity were something served by permission. Now the people who had tried to reduce her to an afterthought were left with the emptiness they had created for themselves. And Margaret, alas, no longer waited for anyone to decide her worth.